Thank you very much, Rodrigo, for the introduction. Can you all hear me properly?
Yes, we do.
Cool. So, first, I would like to thank very kindly Filipe and Flávio for the invitation to present here today. What I have for you is a bit of a summary of my doctoral dissertation, which I recently handed in. And as the title says, I discuss three different conceptions in Husserl's Phenomenology of Empathy. I'm going to share my screen now. Unfortunately, I cannot choose to share just the PowerPoint, which means you're going to be seeing everything. And I can't see you, but I'm going to trust you're all there. Very well. You can see the PowerPoint?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Very well. So I want to present today, as I said, a bit of a summary of my doctoral dissertation. There's a lot to discuss, so I'm going to be moving a bit faster in some parts to try to present to you my main thesis, which basically says that there are indeed at least three conceptions of empathy in Husserl's Phenomenology. So the first thing to clarify is what do we mean by empathy. It's a very ambiguous, equivocal term that is used in very different sense. Here, following Husserl, I understand it purely and exclusively as a cognitive performance, or in a more phenomenological terminology, as a theoretical act. In this sense, we distinguish empathy from other experiences such as sympathy, compassion, or emotional contagion. The main idea is that empathy constitutes a class of intentional acts, and the common element to these three conceptions and the different forms I will be discussing is that it's always directed at others, that is, other subjects, in order to know them as such, to determine them, constitute them as subjects of experience, or to know about them, about their concrete experiences, erlebnisse. Empathy, says Husserl in a short manuscript published in Husserliana 13, is not about how I would feel, think, or act wherein the situation of the other, but about how the other herself feels, thinks, acts, wishes, etc. In this sense, Husserl even comes to the conclusion that Einfühlung ein falscher Ausdruck is, that empathy is a wrong expression to name the phenomenon he wants to deal with. This is important also to make it clear that we are taking the term empathy, and this maybe connects a bit to the question that Flávio asked Paulo this morning. We are taking a terminological decision and saying, let us use the concept empathy, Einfühlung, despite it being ambiguous and used in very different ways in normal language, and let's use it to focus on this very specific intentional performance. So, the first problem that we deal with, or that I decided to deal with when dealing with empathy, arises from the noetic-noematic structure of intentionality and consciousness. Empathy as an act is noetically defined, but that means that we need to know what its intentional correlate is. An intentional correlate is the other, or the alter ego, as Husserl names it with the Latin expression. These two expressions, I believe, Husserl uses when he wants to mean the other in its utmost generality, without determining her in any specific way. This goes also very well with the concept of monad, which Husserl starts discussing a bit later in his philosophy, in Ideas 2 already. That is to be understood as the concretization of transcendental subjectivity, and also as its encompassing unit. The monad is always a concrete unity that encompasses everything that a subject is and has lived and has access to. I will, for the purpose of my presentation, distinguish between three different levels of the monad, where we have to keep in mind that this distinction is an abstract distinction or a critical distinction in the Kantian sense. That is, we are distinguishing things through the phenomenological method that do not actually exist separately. I'm going to go with this rather fast, so I won't be stopping with the quotations unless there are some relevant questions specific to each one of it. The first monadic level I identify is that of the pure or transcendental I, that we know very well from the ideas 1, but also from the ideas 2. I understand this level of the monad as an abstraction that the transcendental phenomenologist performs in order to describe the essential structures of consciousness. It is, in my interpretation, Husserl's answer to the question, what does it mean to be a subject, in contrast to being an object. This pure I is then characterized in its essential structures by the principle of intentionality, or consciousness is consciousness of something, which also gives rise to the so-called noetic-noematic correlation. We have to always describe the acts and its components and the objects that are intended to these acts. The pure I functions as the unity of the flow of experiences, the Erlebnisstrom. All experiences that are experienced are the experiences of this one I. The consciousness has a horizontal character in the sense that all object that is experienced is always experienced surrounded by a thematic field, by, as it is very clear in the example of sensory perception, where I intend something in the background of other things that are given but not attended to. The pure I is wandelbar. It has the property of the Wandelbarkeit, changeability. I translated it roughly in its modes, but not in its properties, because the pure I has no properties as such. That means that it can be more active in its contributed activity or sinking to passivity. That means it can also freely change where the focus of attention goes. Temporality is an essential structure of consciousness that goes also hand in hand with the horizontal character. The primal horizontal structure is the one of time, where I always live in a moment of present, a thick present, surrounded by my retentions in memory to the past and my protensions or expectations towards the future. And finally, the pure I can be originally apprehended through acts of reflection within the phenomenological attitude. That is, we have an identical I, which is nothing for itself, in and for itself. Considered abstractively, it is completely empty of contents. It is the center of function. Second monadic level concerns the so-called empirical I. We have a lot of polysemy at this level. Husserl refers to I identified as this level with the terms empirical, real, constituted, psychological, psychophysical I. I take all these terms to be synonyms to name the incarnation of transcendental subjectivity into the this unit of the empirical I. That means that from the transcendental perspective, it is transcendental consciousness itself that constitutes its own self as an embodied being. This opens for Husserl the so-called region of animalia, of animated beings. And a very specific unit within this level is the unit human, Mensch, which is a double unity of body and soul, or body and consciousness. This unit in particular is already intersubjectively mediated, as we will see when I get there. The third and final monadic level is the person, or personal I, spirit, spiritual I, personal or spiritual subject. And this can be briefly characterized as being the social I. It is always, this level only makes sense on the basis of intersubjectivity and the performances of empathy. With it, another ontological region is constituted, to which Husserl referred to in the ideas 2 as the geistige Welt, the spiritual world, and later he will sort of merge this concept with a very famous one of Lebenswelt, life world. one of the fundamental characteristics of a person is that she's constituted in her relation to a surrounding world of Umwelt, to the objects with which she comes in constant contact. Expression can be considered the fundamental unity within the region of the spiritual world, that is, physical objects, natural objects acquire a layer of sense that refers to different things like functions or meanings themselves when we talk about language proper. And it's also applied to the unity that the body and soul form. In this sense, it's that we can say that you read the expressions of a body as being expressions of mental states or letters. Finally, motivation, a phenomenon that we actually already know from the first level, from the level of the pure I, because Husserl also claims that the pure I is motivated to constitute the object it constitutes, but it is defined in the ideas too as the fundamental law of the spiritual world. That is, both for constitutive acts as well as for actions and desires, we are motivated to experience the way we do. And pursuing these motivational threads is what accounts for the proper relations within the spiritual life. So these monadic levels, as I said in the beginning, are to be understood as abstractions that we perform in the phenomenological analysis. They do not correspond to different entities that would exist in and for themselves in some separate place. And it is also important to bear in mind that there are not several authors for different acts, if one were to ask, but who constitutes this? The pure I or the empirical I or the personal I claim these questions are rather ill-formed. We should understand that the constitutive function is always attributed to the pure I, and what we are trying to uncover through this distinction of the monadic levels is what else is supposed in order for the I to be able to perform its constitutive performances. So with this very brief schematic presentation of the monadic levels, we can now go, well, here I have a bit of my summary, not translated. We can go back to that if there are any questions later. My thesis is then that there are at least 3 different conceptions of empathy in Husserl's work. The first one I term transcendental empathy, and I consider this to be the only topic of the 5th Cartesian meditation. It is understood as the search for the transcendental evidence of our knowledge about the alter ego, and aims to serve as the answer to the objection of solipsism, which would enable phenomenology to become transcendental, intersubjective transcendental phenomenology, as opposed to purely transcendental subjectivity or egology. Natural empathy is how I term the phenomenological description of how the other is constituted as I, as a human, as an empirical I, and as a person or a personal I within the natural attitude. This is not entirely different from some of the concepts that are familiar to us from the 5th Cartesian meditation. For example, the apprehension of the live body, of the living body, and the human apperception. I don't know if that's a standard notation, but the German is Menschapperzeption. And finally, daily empathy is a term I use to refer to that which would probably come closest to our naive or natural understanding of the term. That is the whole range of possible acts that we can perform directed at concrete others in order to learn, come to know about their concrete experiences. I believe that the phenomenological task here is to identify what these different forms, possibilities are, and what is the evidence we have for them, and so offer a sort of general classification of empathic acts within this level or within this conception of daily empathy. Before I start with the first one, I like to point out that my distinction is not to be found verbatim in Husserl's own work. It's rather exegetical conclusion of mine, but there is at least this place where Husserl draws a very similar distinction only between two different conceptions, namely psychological empathy, which would coincide with my conception of natural empathy, and transcendental empathy, which coincides with my transcendental empathy as well. Husserl sees that the psychological empathy and the phenomenological task of accounting for it is founded upon the results of transcendental empathy. So, beginning with transcendental empathy, this is mainly an exegetical work on the fifth Cartesian meditation. It is not the only place where Husserl deals with empathy in this way. There are several texts in the Relativity Bands where he does so, but the fifth Cartesian meditation is obviously the most systematic one and without doubt the most famous one. So, I claim that the objection of solipsism is, as a matter of fact, the topic of the fifth Cartesian meditation. This is explicitly claimed by Husserl. He presents the objection in the following way, and I quote, "When I, the meditating I, reduce myself to my absolute transcendental ego through the phenomenological epoche, have I not then become a solus ipse? And don't I remain one as long as I practice the consequent self-interpretation under the title of Phenomenology?" I believe that Husserl's formulation is a bit misleading because one could answer to these questions positively and still have no objection of solipsism in the sense in which he wants to deal with. The sense in which he wants to deal with is, to refer to Paulo's presentation, a skeptical sense. It's the sense that claims that you have no evidence, no justified knowledge to claim that you know about the existence of others. This formulation from Husserl I claim to be misleading because I believe that one could answer positively to these questions without incurring in a skeptical solipsism. Husserl himself does this in many places of his works, for example, the Ideas 2, where he speaks about a methodological solipsism that I would say is characteristic of the transcendental epoche and the transcendental reduction. In that I suspend my naive belief in the existence of the world, I also suspend my naive belief in the existence of other subjects and therefore become a sort of solus ipse, a solitary meditating ego. But doing that is not incurring in skeptical solipsism. So I reformulate in the following way. Can I, the meditating I, after carrying out the epoche and transcendental reduction, recuperate the other as really being, as real transcendental I's? Can transcendental phenomenology take the step from the methodological motivated solipsism to transcendental intersubjectivity? Can phenomenology, without abandoning its own methods, account for the existence of the alter ego and a common world? So, against other interpretations, for example, the very famous one from Carr in 1973 and the one from Stella that basically takes on Carr, I believe that what is at stake is whether phenomenology can or not account for the existence of other subjects and not merely for the meaning of another I or the sense of another I, as Carr argues. What is at stake is phenomenology's ability, methodological ability, so to speak, to account for the sphere of intersubjectivity. This seems to be the interpretation of many other authors, not just I against Carr, but many others also see both in the fifth and in the method itself of transcendental phenomenology a risk of solipsism that should be addressed, like, for example, Dan Zahavi. By solipsism, one normally understands a position that either claims that there only exists one single consciousness, namely one's own, or that argues that it's impossible to know whether there are in fact any other subjects besides oneself. But why this criticism? Because the very effectuation of the epoche and the transcendental reduction seem to restrict the field of research of phenomenology in advance to the phenomenologizing individual's own consciousness and phenomena. In order to address this objection of solipsism, Husserl says that he's going to take the thematic thread of the other as it is given. This is a very typical move in Husserl's phenomenology. We begin with a problem that is motivated by our experiences in the natural attitude. This is where we take on, this is the stock of phenomena from which we take on in order to perform phenomenological analysis. So this other as a thematic thread is highlighted by Husserl regarding three elements he thinks that his account in the fifth should deal with. First of all, and most important, and again against Carr's interpretation, that the other is experienced as really being, wirklich sein. So it's not about accounting for an illusion of another or the other as purely phenomenon, but it is about showing that we can find the evidence in our experience to claim that others really exist. The second element is that the other is experienced as an object in the world, that is, as a psychophysical I, connected to a body which is part of the world which I experience. This corresponds to my second level of the monad. Finally, through the other, I experience the world not as a private construction, but as foreign to me, intersubjective, being there for everyone, jedermann sein. That is the main characteristic that the other gives to all the objects of my experience, to my whole world of experience. Through the other, it is that those objects gain this extra layer of sense, which is being really there for others and not just me, and thus it is that the fifth Cartesian meditation aims to account for the experience of empathy, or generally the experience of the foreign, and thus show that the world is intersubjective, objective, and not a pure solipsistic egoic construction. The fifth Cartesian meditation, as was also dealt with by Paolo's presentation this morning, is also famous for introducing some very specific and methodological tools that are not present in other parts of the work. In particular, even though Husserl claims at the beginning that of the fifth meditation that we, during the whole course of the Cartesian meditations, that is from the very first one up to that point, we have always been within the attitude of the transcendental epoche and the transcendental reduction. We must carry out an extra epoche, which he calls a thematic one, and a reduction to the sphere of ownness, Eigenheitssphäre. Unlike the universal epoche itself and the transcendental reduction, which it is a matter of discussion, but in general it is agreed that one can perform one without performing the other, I believe that the thematic epoche is pretty much the performance of a reduction to this sphere of ownness. This sphere is characterized by abstracting from all intersubjective mediation. That is mainly and foremost this third sense that I pointed out here, the jedermann sein. That's what needs to be abstracted. And further, all constituted objects that can only be constituted through intersubjective mediation. I quote here Stroker's interpretation, which I find one of the most solid ones regarding this matter. She says, with this thematic epoche, all determinations of the phenomenal world, which, according to that sense, refer to other subjects, are to be eliminated. Thus, all those sense components that posit validities of whatever being, which I, as it were, cannot constitute alone, slip away. Expressed noetically, for the time being, I cancel all sense constitution which is co-achieved through alien subjectivity. So, one can, for example, as Alfred Schutz has done, ask, is this possible? What does this mean? Can we really abstract from all these intersubjectively mediated performances? Well, one thing to point out is that one sense of the abstraction means simply not considering, that is, leaving aside these objects and not making them the topic of our investigation. And in that sense, is that Michael Barber, in a very good paper in which he recovers the lost text of Dorian Cairns, in which he dealt very thoroughly with truth criticism, that we can, as a matter of fact, do this in a very similar way in which the natural scientist does this when he refers to nature, which is, according to Husserlian phenomenology, the result of an abstracting process. Nature, as studied by the natural science, paradigmatically by physical science, is the abstraction of culture, society, and more than anything, subjectivity, in order to consider nature as such, without any other further determinations. So something similar, says Barber, is what we have to do in this second or thematic epoch. So, what happens with this sphere of wholeness? I believe that the most important result of this sort of thought experiment that Husserl carries out is that I can constitute my own living body, my life, as such, without any need of intersubjective mediation. This is also a very interesting result in as much as it is one that we can perform ourselves, that we can find the evidence for. My own body is constituted as a living body in direct reference to my experience of it. That is, as the body that I can freely control, freely move, the body through which I perceive the world, and I can act in the world, deal and handle with the different objects in the world. Quoting Heinemann, Husserl points out that in this artificially reduced perceptual environment, that is how the sphere of wholeness is to be understood, one thing and only one immediately sets itself apart from all other things. This is our own living body. It stands out exactly as living, that is, as having sensations of different sorts, most crucially sensations of touch and movement, and being freely and directly movable by us. No other thing can have the sense of living within this artificially isolated environment, since all other conscious selves are temporarily reduced, including those that can sense. In other words, my own living body within the artificial scenario of the sphere of wholeness is to be understood as a sui generis entity. That is, there is only one object within the sphere of wholeness that is alive, my own. No other body can be, in a first moment, identified as such. It is very important that this sphere of wholeness cannot and is not to be understood in a developmental sense, as if it would refer to a period in the objective time of the monad when the person lived without any kind of intersubjective mediation. This is evidently false, that there is no such period in objective time for any single human being that we know as such. The sphere of wholeness is the product of a meditating philosopher who abstracts from the specific intentional performances of intersubjectivity in order to discover a relation of foundation. In this very specific case, we discover that I can constitute my own living body fully without any need of intersubjective mediation. So, now that we have isolated this first result, we can analyze the concrete challenge that empathy as a form of experience poses to the phenomenological theory. The core of the issue is that I have no direct experiential original, as Husserl says, access to the foreign experiences of awareness. That is, I cannot reflect or perceive what the other experiences. So, how do I know? How am I allowed to legitimately say that there is an other like I who also has experiences like I do? The analysis relies upon the already known by that time concept of a presentation of non-given sides. As it is the case of any sensory perception, we say that a perception is the sensuous giveness of one side of a specific object that is apperceived as the object it is. So I apperceive the chair as a chair, even though I perceive only one side of the chair, which is presented to me. The other sides are always either emptily or presentified in fantasy, but apprehended. So, in the case of the other, this applies not only to the material physical body of the other, which is a three-dimensional object like any other, which can also be seen from different perspectives, but when I perceive an other, what I do is I present a consciousness like my own. And in the case of the material objects, I can always bring these appresented sides to a presentation in that I move around the object or I move the object around me, and I have a direct originary access to each of the possible sides of the object. So what does it mean that I present a consciousness of which I cannot have a presentation in the case of the other? Husserl says a first guide offers us the sense of the word other I. Alter says alter ego, and the ego that is implied there is myself, constituted within the primordial ownness and in individuality as a psychophysical unity. That is, what I am presenting is an ego like myself, that would be, in the strict terms of Husserlian phenomenology, a transcendental I, a constituting I, and a psychophysical I, because it has a body that is occupying a space in the even world. So, as it is maybe better known, Husserl's analysis rely on the concept of pairing. Pairing is a phenomenon that we know from other spheres of experience. It is basically what happens when we see two things that display sensory similarity. We tend to group them passively in a blow, Husserl says, in an Schlag, without having to judge. And they are given to me precisely as a pair, or even as a pair, or even as a greater quantity of things, such as the typical examples with a swarm of birds or a group of people. The peculiar thing is that the pairing here happens between myself and the other. What is paired, basically, is the sense living body. But because within the sphere of ownness, I only knew with evidence my living body to be a living body, is that this act of pair also serves as a sort of primordial institution, an Urstift. A new sense becomes instituted, and that is the sense living body, not as the name of a specific entity that is unique, my own body, but as a whole class of objects. So, when another body appears in my perceptual field that displays certain sensory traits, like the way it looks, but especially because of the way it behaves, it moves, it relates to the other commonly perceived objects of nature, I become passively motivated to pair with this body, and in doing so, I transfer the sense living body and the sense I from myself to this other body. Thus, at the end, I have another I like myself who lives in another living body like my own. So, this is the analysis, very, very fast summary of the analysis that Husserl offers in the fifth meditation, where he claims to find that this is the transcendental evidence we need to account for the existence of other. The fact that the way that the foreign body looks and the way that the foreign body behaves will motivate this transfer of sense even within the artificially reduced context of the sphere of ownness in the fifth meditation. So what becomes constitute is another, both as a psychophysical or empirical I, because the body is the primary means of access to the other, is what serves as a founding element in the experience of the other, but also as a transcendental I. This, I claim, together with Stroker, implies a sort of extra step for the meditating philosopher, while the other is apprehended as a living body, or as living in a living body, as I said, in a blow, by the passive motivation of the common sensory traits and the behavior. I need to perform an act of reflection in order to come to know her, the other, as a transcendental I. This is in perfect correlation to the way it is for transcendental subjectivity. I have always been a transcendental I, but I didn't know that that was the case until I performed the phenomenological epoche and reduction and learned that I am a transcendental consciousness that constitutes the world for itself. The same applies to the other. The other is always a transcendental I, and regardless of whether she performed or not the transcendental epoche, I can come to this conclusion because it's motivated or even, forced by the analysis of transcendental phenomenology itself. Moving to natural empathy, and probably a bit faster because of the time left. We abandon this artificial scenario. We don't perform any kind of abstraction to a scenario where I do not have intersubjective mediation, and I try to account phenomenologically for the way in which I constitute others as such within the natural attitude. The result that my own living body is constituted in self-experience, or that it does not need of intersubjective mediation, is carried over from transcendental empathy. It's a valuable result that applies to conscious life in general. And this is what offers the basis for the so-called Leibauffassung, or the apprehension of the other bodies as living bodies. And this is completely independent of developmental matters. That is how children, as a matter of fact, come to acquire concepts or senses or specific references to corporality and subjectivity. The point is, I argue that even if a child were to acquire the concept living body as he acquires any other concept, that is by learning and interacting with objects and generating habitualities and empirical typicities, still the meaning, the deep sense of what it is to be a living body is given in evidence in self-experience, which does not require at the level of intersubjective mediation. So, the biggest difference, in my opinion, with the transcendental empathy is that in natural empathy, there is no pairing. This is something that I claim basically out of my own phenomenological analysis. I do not believe that each time I see a human being, I am somehow, in some sense, apprehending myself as part of a greater pair. I simply recognize human beings by being cases of a type that is known to me. This is also what Husserl will refer to in a moment as the Mensch Apperception, the perception of humans. So, my apperception of objects as eyes can be fulfilled, that is fulfilled, through acts of presentification of foreign subjectivity, but never of presentation. At the level of natural empathy, we refer only to the fact that the other is in fact an alter ego, a consciousness like my own, and not to concrete specific experiences that the other would undergo.
Excuse me, Matias,
yes,
just to tell you that it is 2:45, and it would be great to have some time for the discussion.
Absolutely.
So consider this. Maybe 10 minutes for discussion would be terrific.
Yes, absolutely. That was the original plan. I did begin a bit later though, but I'm going to jump ahead. So I will leave the specificities of the unity human, the double unity. I can start the presentation from here. I'm sorry. So, the unity human is a double unity of body and soul, or body and consciousness, and this I first apperceive in the other and then transfer to myself. The other is the first I, not I. I'll only mention then that the other is also the constitution of the other as a person is also to be discussed within the context of natural empathy. The idea here is that this is the primary way in which we experience others, that is, as people from our world with whom, as Profs says, we encounter, we might pay or not attention to them, but they are there. Empathy is to be distinguished from relationships of from interpersonal relationships and communication, even though these have a founding role for the constitution of the spiritual world as such. Finally, daily empathy, as I said, is referred to concrete experiences of the other and to the different ways in which I can have an access to the other. Thus, I distinguish following Husserl, between authentic and inauthentic empathy, depending on whether or not I am actually thematizing the foreign stream of consciousness. I distinguish between perception and theory-based empathy, to point to the distinction in which I am thematizing the foreign body as a field of expression, or I'm simply relating, inferring, understanding, accounting for wishes, desires, expectations, facts about the life of the other. I can perform my empathic acts as suppositions without actually knowing what the other is experiencing, or knowing what the other is experiencing, aiming for a greater, deeper understanding. Following Husserl, we can also distinguish different levels of typicality. The interesting thing is that in the case of humans, or maybe of animated beings in general, we have individual types, that is for concrete, specific individuals, and not just for classes of individuals. And I'm going to skip because I'm not going to be able to explain all this, but I would only refer to Husserl's concept of transposition in fantasy and neutrality modification as the way in which he tries to account for our highest empathic commitment, so to speak. When we really want to know and understand the other fully, we need to know about the other, and we need to perform certain acts of neutrality modification in order to be able to experience what the other experienced without experiencing it as I would experience. So that is what the neutrality aims to do, to give me intuitive content of the experiences of the other. And conclusions: empathy, in any of these conceptions, makes its own class of intentional acts in which presentation and presentification come together in a very specific way. The three conceptions do not refer to different classes of acts, but to one and the same. So this opens the question, which is an honest question from me, one in which I came at the very end of my dissertation when it was already written and ready to hand in. How exactly are we to understand the relation between these concepts? At some point, it seems that there is a certain foundational relation in the phenomenological sense at play, at least in a methodological sense, because transcendental empathy aims to found the phenomenological attempt to direct itself towards intersubjectivity. And it would also seem to be the case that daily empathy is founded upon natural empathy, in the very obvious sense that I need to know that there is at all another there and identify her as such in order to be able to perform concrete acts of empathy directed towards her. But further than that, I think that what these conceptions are and how are we to name them or classify them phenomenologically is still an open question. I thank you very much for your attention.